Well, joining me now from Melbourne is Brendan O'Connor. Brendan O'Connor, thanks for your time. Just wanted to ask you first about the floods.
Not at all.
Are you of the belief that the support on the ground in places like northern New South Wales and Queensland, where floods are occurring, is adequate at the moment?
Well, I don't think they've been adequate. I think the government's been really not investing sufficiently in flood mitigation. If you think about the fund that's been established 3 years ago, $4.8 billion, an emergency response fund, not a cent has actually been spent yet on the construction of culverts, drainage systems, evacuation centres, anything like that. So,
Mr. O'Connor, I understand all that. I take that point, but I'm talking about the emergency rescue.
Oh, well, I thought I was just answering your question.
No, but the emergency rescue itself.
Well, obviously, always more can be done. I have to say there's been an enormous effort by emergency workers, professionals, volunteers, the ADF, private citizens who have put themselves on the line, if you like, put their lives on the line to rescue others. There's no doubt that the speed by which this flood hit southeast Queensland and in particular northern New South Wales, Lismore and Ballina, was unprecedented. And therefore, in terms of people responding to that situation, I think people have really been quite remarkable. But I do believe we should have had more mitigation investment in place before these terrible events.
Now, your fellow frontbencher Murray Watt says Shane Stone should resign, that he should be sacked over these comments he made about people rebuilding in flood zones. Now, his comments were quite blunt. But does he have a slight point here in terms of the fact that we keep seeing people rebuild, unfortunately, where flood events are occurring more?
I think Mr. Stone's comments were grossly insensitive. And even if there's a question as to what people may do in relation to where they reside, the idea that a highly paid public official, Scott Morrison's mate, would say such insensitive, offensive things at a time when people are suffering in the way they are is quite remarkable, and frankly he should resign or be sacked.
I wanted to turn to the Ukraine war now. Can you give us some of your general thoughts? And if the conflict extended past May and you were elected, would we see more of what we call lethal aid coming from a Labor government to Ukraine?
Look, that will depend on a variety of circumstances. As you know, Andrew, there's been, this is a horrific situation, almost unprecedented for Europe since the Second World War, an aggressive, unlawful invasion of an independent sovereign state. I believe that the Australian government has done the right thing in responding to requests from Ukraine and from NATO countries, the United States and others, to join the condemnation and, as a consequence, take appropriate action. And that includes lethal and non-lethal aid to Ukraine. Now, our hopes, of course, are that through such action we'll see an end to this violence and this conflict. And of course, until we see anything like that, we need to ratchet up the pressure. So if the government has any other options insofar as increased sanctions, whether it's targeting the oligarchs or whether it's providing lethal aid through NATO, Labor supports that. I'm being briefed on the lethal aid. Obviously, that's a more complex area. And insofar as what we may do if elected, we'll continue to do what the international community are doing in working together to put as much pressure on President Putin as possible in order to see the end of this terrible conflict. So that's where we're at the moment, I think, Andrew.
The government's been trying to say that Labor would reduce the defence budget, that you did so previously. What's your response to that?
Look, there's much been said of that by the government, but if you look at the actual expenditure over the Howard years and the Rudd-Gillard years, the sort of average annual expenditure as a proportion of GDP was between 1.7 and 1.8%. Now, of course, things have changed since then, and they've changed in a way that means that there needs to be greater investment. And since 2013, every Labor leader and Parliamentary Labor Party has supported a minimum of 2%. And the way things are heading, Andrew, I think it's fair to say we'll see a further increase in investment in defence, and Labor supports that approach. I mean, your expenditure sometimes is commensurate with any particular change to risk or instability. And of course, since the Defence White Paper and Strategic Update, there's been no doubt an increased risk to our national interest, and therefore we support expenditure. I will say, though, for all of the heightened rhetoric of the government, for all of the concerns that they've expressed, and we share some of their concerns, there's been very little in terms of delivering firepower, increasing firepower to existing platforms. And I think that's the sort of thing that needs to be considered, along with, of course, the AUKUS agreement and the reinvigoration of the Quad.
Will we see then a defence policy from you before the election, and will that include things like acquiring more missiles, acquiring more firepower, as you put it?
Well, first and foremost, I want to say we support the government and indeed agree that the AUKUS arrangement is something that's critical for our national security, and we agree that it's good to see, through the leadership of President Biden, the reinvigoration of the Quad. These are very important recent developments, but we need to continue to work through regional bodies like ASEAN and reach out to our friends and allies in the region and perhaps do more of that. We've made a very clear decision. Anthony Albanese made clear he wanted to see a Defence Force posture review happen immediately after we were elected. The last time there was a review of such matters was in 2011, so it's overdue, and indeed it will coincide with Biden's global force posture review of the US Defence Force, so we think that would be timely. We also, of course, will want to look at a whole range of other things, including whether there's a capability gap between the Collins-class boats or submarines and the AUKUS arrangements and what comes out of that, and what to do about that. But frankly, Andrew, some of those decisions must be made from government, because you have access to all of the advice of the Defence Department, the ADF and other national security agencies. But I'd just say this, that the government, it is really now on the eve of the election, but the government should have been looking, I think, earlier, given its own concerns about increasing firepower to existing platforms. And I can assure you that our minds have turned to that some time ago, and we're calling on the government really to explain what do we do between now and any of the benefits that arise out of AUKUS. Where will there be investment in defence assets and increasing firepower to existing platforms that will protect our immediate interests, not something in 20 years' time. All
right, well, let me just ask you a couple of things finally, briefly. The first is Peter Dutton has said if China invaded Taiwan and the US went to war, Australia would be with them. Is that Labor's position?
We don't answer questions about hypothetical wars with the nuclear superpowers, and I'd have to say we did not agree with Minister Dutton making such comments. I don't recall any Defence Minister in our history, certainly recent history, that would ever answer a question in the positive about a hypothetical question about whether we would find ourselves engaged in a full-blown war with a nuclear superpower, given the sort of the content of what's been put there. We don't want to see any invasion or incursion on Taiwan. We support Taiwan in the sense that it deserves to be operating autonomously, and we obviously will say to the mainland China that they should desist from such contemplation.
Sure,
but it would be completely wrong and wrong-headed for us to be answering such hypotheticals, and we think the Defence Minister made a mistake in that regard.
And just finally, has Anthony Albanese guaranteed you'll be Defence Minister if Labor is elected?
Well, can I say he's obviously already been saying publicly that he wants me to be Defence Minister if we're elected. I'd be very happy to serve. He asked me to undertake this portfolio. I've obviously had national security portfolios in the areas of immigration and home affairs. I've sat on the National Security Committee of Cabinet before, and I think I'm well equipped to take this task. Ultimately, that's within the remit of the leader. I'm very happy to serve. I'm very happy to serve in an elected Albanese Labor government, Andrew.
Brendan O'Connor, thanks for your time.
Thank you.